Thanks for joining us this morning for our webinar on landscape rehydration in WA. So this event is supported by the Department of Water and Environmental Regulation through their Soil-Wise program. My name is Bonnie Jupp and I manage the RegenWA program here at Perth NRM. And before we begin, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands we're all zooming in from today and pay our respects to the cultural elders of the past, present and emerging, and acknowledge their spiritual connection to country. So we're very pleased to have Lance Mudgway from the Mulloon Institute and Warren Pensini from Blackwood Valley Beef joining us today. So we're keen to dive into the overarching concepts of landscape rehydration with Lance and how the Mulloon Institute works with farmers to educate and assist in implementing on-farm works to help hold water in the landscape and build resilience to the effects of climate change. So we'll hear from Lance first, and then we'll jump to Warren, who runs beef in Boyup Brook and is currently working with Lance and the Mulloon Institute to conduct rehydration works on his property. So it'd be just interesting to hear the farmer perspective and especially to get an understanding from a local WA point of view as well. So I guess how this webinar will work, we'll go through the presentations, but if you have any questions throughout, you can pop them in the little Q&A box down the bottom. And then we can go through them after each presenter has finished their presentation. And if we have time at the end, we can go through any more you may have. So feel free to pop any questions in the chat box and we'll see how we go at the end as well. So with all of that, I will hand over to Lance to get us started. So thanks, Lance.
Thanks for RegenWA for inviting us to do this little webinar. So Mulloon Institute is, I'll tell you a little bit about the Mulloon Institute. So it was established by Tony Coote after having works done by Peter Andrews on his farm. But the idea was to apply science around the concept of natural sequence farming, which is the concept that Peter Andrews put forward, and building understanding and capacity with landholders and the agricultural industry in general. Another aim is to increase the number of demonstrations across Australia and then to more broadly make it happen across Australia. And also there's the Mulloon Consulting branch, which is basically a fee-for-service part of the organisation. So the main part of the Mulloon Institute is the Mulloon Rehydration Initiative. So there's 70-odd leaky weirs being put in or have been put in the incised Mulloon Creek with the aim of slowing the water in the creek, raising the bed profile and putting floodwater back on the floodplain to rehydrate the floodplain. There's also been contours and quite a bit of revegetation to aid redistribution of water higher in the landscape and hold it there to basically not allow it to run straight down the stream and into the creek. There's also a lot of monitoring going on of both physical and biological changes in the landscape. So that's encompassing hydrological, soils, plants, plant growth and fauna as well. So just a very quick snapshot, one view. So this is Peter's Pond, which was installed in just after 2006. And you can see the difference there between and in the site between the works and not having the works beforehand. So you can see that there's it's a more stable bed and banks with no exposure of the banks to water. There's much greater nutrient filtration and retention. It just looks a lot more hydrated, despite the fact that that second image was taken during drought. And ultimately, it increases the catchment's resilience to external factors such as climate, drought, fire and flood. So what is landscape rehydration? Essentially, it's restoring the natural water cycle and water balance on land to allow the landscape to function in support of agricultural and ecological outcomes. We give nature a helping hand where it's needed to restore that function, and principally aim to increase the growing plants over longer periods of the year. So we use physical interventions only where they're needed, and maybe where we can speed up that process with targeted plantings and other physical interventions. So just a little bit about the principles of what we're on about. Most people would be familiar with the water cycle, and that's a very, very simplistic diagram of the water cycle. But most people are probably not aware that it actually comes in two parts. So there's the large water cycle over the ocean, and then there's a small water cycle over the land. And the small water cycle is only about 14% of the total water volume that circles around the Earth. And only about 12% moves from the large water cycle to the small water cycle and back. And you can see my pointer, we've changed these numbers, the 14% going up from the land and the 12% going from the land back to the ocean. We've fiddled around with those numbers, so we've upset that small water cycle. So one of the really important things about landscape rehydration is taking note of the role that vegetation plays, and it's a crucial role in maintaining the water cycle on land. So it's the main avenue of that 14% that goes back up to the sky over the land, and that's evapotranspiration. It also plays a critical role in modifying our climate. So the transition of liquid water into vapor requires energy, and that's drawn from the water vapor itself, and that's called latent heat, which some of you may have heard of. So the evapotranspiration uses energy and cools the air, and then in the opposite, when it condenses, it releases that energy back and warms up the air. So that's why you get a more, so it's like a natural reverse cycle air conditioner. So examples, if you've ever been close to the ocean, you'll know that there's very few frosts, and your temperatures tend to be milder in the hot part of the day as well. And the same on a green lawn, as opposed to standing out in a paddock. You'll find that the green lawn area is cooler in the heat of the day, and it'll also be slightly warmer in the cool of night. And another example is rainforest. You'll find that that's a lot more humid environment with a lot more vegetation, cooler in the heat of the day and warmer at the cool of night. Really graphic example of this in WA is the boundary of the rabbit-proof fence. And these images are taken obviously in summer. On the left, we've got the predominantly cleared agricultural land and in summer, minimal growing vegetation. And on the right, you've got Great Western Woodlands, which is pretty much 100% growing vegetation cover. And you can see there, you've got clouds forming over the vegetated area, the woodland area, and that's through the evapotranspiration and then the cooling of that water as it reaches higher level in the atmosphere. May not cause rain, but it certainly aids with cooling of that landscape. And the other thing is, you can see on the left-hand image, the left-hand side is quite pale colour, whereas the right-hand side, the bush is dark. So that's a change in albedo, which is the reflectivity of the Earth's surface. And that also changes the way heat's transferred through the ground and through the atmosphere, or energy. Vegetation also has a role to play in cycling nutrients. So there's a symbiotic relationship with the soil biology. The biology makes nutrients available to plant roots in return for sugars or energy from the plants. And also the plants supply organic matter through leaf litter, branches, etc., that fall off the trees or plants. And obviously when they die, they also provide organic matter or carbon back to the soil and back to the biology. The biology helps to improve soil structure and also moisture holding capacity, and therefore supports increased plant growth. And then you've got a building upward cycle. And we aim to support this building cycle through the initial provision of water, which is a critical part of the whole system. Just lastly, green plants with water and resultant microclimates allow the sun's energy to be dissipated through the biosphere. And you can just see on that diagram in the left, the heat is a lot bigger coming out of the system, as opposed to the right where that energy is transferred through the evapotranspiration. So getting into a little bit more about what we do. So one of our planning guides is to divide the landscape into 3 zones. So higher up, we mostly use plants, and that system will accumulate nutrients and biomass to supply through gravity down into the middle system, which is our production zone. And then at the bottom of that zone, we'll have a nutrient filtration and or recovery zone. So where we pick up all the nutrients that are left and store it in vegetation, and then using grazing animals, or we can do it mechanically, but prefer not to because it's costly. We can train the animals to then transfer that nutrient back up to the recharge zone where it cycles through again. And you can see an example from Warren's property on the right, just where we've mapped the discharge zone, mid-slope zone and recharge zone, which are kind of equivalent to those 3 zones. So the second main planning guide, and it's probably the important one, is we aim to slow the flow. So essentially what might be happening now is a very sharp high peak of flow over time, over a short period of time. And we need to transfer this so it's a lower flow, lower peak discharge and spread over a much longer time. And that allows the landscape to absorb more water in the whole system, which then obviously makes it more resilient to drought, etc. One critical point that we need to observe is that water is the most erosive force in nature, and the flow energy or erosive power is related to the parameters that you can see on the screen there. So if you halve the velocity, you'll actually reduce the energy of the flow by 225%, so by 4 times. If you halve the depth, you'll halve the energy. And if you double the roughness, you'll halve the energy. And that's based on a factor rather than the actual height of vegetation or whatever. Also, if you decrease the slope, say by 10%, then you'll decrease the energy by the same amount. And increasing the width of flow will actually reduce the depth. And you'll notice there, if you increase the width and reduce the depth, you're also effectively increasing the roughness, because the same height of vegetation will be higher in relation to the flow. We use all these techniques to slow the flow. So our ultimate aim is to increase the longevity of green growth and enable plants to create natural water cycling functions that it did in the past. Just want to quickly cover off on how this plays out with salinity. And I guess it's important to understand how salinity forms in our landscape in WA. So the original landscape, there was very little runoff in the small and medium-sized events. That's because the native vegetation basically held it up and formed its own little contours to stop water running down the slope. And there was very little continuous flow in the main valley floors. And you would have seen, if you've been out into the eastern wheat belt in particular, that there's actually no real defined rivers in those areas. They're just little tiny small channels and mostly a system of chain of lakes and pools. The only time there'd be continuous flow is after really big rainfall events, and that's when the water would basically just flood out over the whole valley floor. So if we look at how salinity is caused in our landscapes, we can see that landscape rehydration is not necessarily incompatible with a saline landscape. And in fact, can actually help us address the salinity. So in a current landscape, there's a lot less vegetation to absorb the rainfall and protect the soils. So we get more runoff, especially in those medium and large events. And we start getting continuous flow in the valley floors in smaller events, so not the floods. And that results in erosion and creation of channels. And we can see that now that there are now channels in the wheat belt between the lakes, and they've actually pulled the plug on some of those lakes, but then there's other lakes that haven't. So there's actually more water getting into that valley floor. That's increasing the storage, holding it for longer, and that's increasing the recharge in the valley floor, which is raising the saline water tables, and that's where we get the salinity from. So on a local scale, excess recharge migrates through groundwater and leads to discharge downslope, and that's often associated with subsurface features like dikes of rock or clay highs, and the primary result is waterlogging. That reduces the diversity of vegetation and may even bare the soil and allows the infestation of undesirable species like Juncus acutus in that image, which is the sharp brush. And then over time, although the groundwater is usually not very saline, it does still contain salt, and over time that evaporates at the surface. The water evaporates at the surface, leaving the salt behind, and you gradually get concentration of salts on the surface, and then that washes off through runoff and runs into the nearest creek, and then that gets stored in the valley floor somewhere down below, and so we get an increased accumulation of salt in the valley floors as well. So I guess the next step is to what we do. What we do is we start preparing a whole farm plan or catchment plan if we're looking at a catchment scale. We gather information, and that might involve a detailed site assessment, and it might include a digital terrain model like that image on the left. And this is actually Warren's plan and his property. And the aim is to address the issues identified on the property and we do that in a way that's suitable to the landscapes, the slopes and the climate, suitable to the farming operation. So obviously a primarily grazing operation will be doing different things than if it was primarily cropping. And we generally try and aim to make our interventions multi-purpose and integrated. So they'll serve several purposes with one thing. So just zooming in a little bit. So Warren's plan contains contour banks and a significant amount of revegetation on the recharge areas, which is basically those pale yellow areas, and some corridors to link up patches of bush and the revegetation, which are the green ones. And zooming in a little bit further to this area here, we can do some small interventions to try and hold the water up on this saline scald, which is below a groundwater seepage, so that hillside seepage that I talked about just before. And we've got some little pinweirs and some brush mattressing around that area to try and encourage building up of the sediment and rebuilding the soil on that area and provide cover on that area. And above that, we've also got a contour with some revegetation on it to try and help soak up some of the water that's discharging at this point here. So I just wanted to quickly run through what we're actually doing in WA at the moment. Our main flagship is the WA Community Stewardship Grant project funded by the Natural Resource Management Program of WA. And it's called Landscape Rehydration Trial and Demonstration of the Wheat Belt of WA, which is a really exciting title. And so one of the aspects of that project is to implement the plan on Warren's property. And then we've also got 3 properties where we're doing full landscape rehydration plans, and also doing education events like what we'll be holding next week at Warren's property. And we've set up an information hub, which is on the RegenWA website, and hopefully you'll find that after this webinar. And I've just got another project in there which has been run through Avongrow, which is another project funded by State NRM, and we did a landscape rehydration plan for that property as well, further east in the wheat belt. So just zooming in a little bit, so this is Coenda, which is up at Bunteen, which is a demonstration of landscape rehydration in WA context, like all three properties. They're all different landscapes and productions. So Coenda is low rainfall with extensive saline valley floors, which are currently unproductive. Cropping is an important part of the property and their operation. There's great opportunities here to make the valley floor productive again with salt-tolerant vegetation, mulching and grazing management. Improve cropping through use of vegetation and aligning onto the contour. Addressing waterlogging on the margins of the valley floor, so these areas here, and also you can see up these depressions on the slopes, with a couple of different, well, they're actually old methods being reused to try and make that water actually move out onto the drier parts. Muresk is our second property. Really good opportunity due to its location and the fact that it's high profile with all the students and visitors that come there. It's a difficult terrain because it's extensive granite outcrop, quite steep in places. It's a different operation, so it's mixed cropping and grazing. Waterlogging is the main issue, but salinity is only a minor issue. And as you can see there, the waterlogging is quite extensive, all these green dark patches. Waterlogged areas, so we're looking at a combination of contours to pull water out of the waterways and spread it onto dry slopes, and a lot of vegetation to increase the water use. And our last property is at Carrolup, recently purchased property, which gives us a bit of a clean slate to work from. There's been a bit of work done in the past on the salinity that's on the property, but we can work around that. And it's mixed cropping, but primarily focused on grazing property. The state of the fencing means that we can basically move things around to match our interventions with lower cost, because we need to put in new fencing anyway. And that'll suit grazing and holistic management objectives of the property. And obviously the salinity and the waterlogging are significant issues that we need to address, and that'll be done through redistribution of the freshwater higher on the slope, and again perennial revegetation, and that might be productive or native. And that's it. And if you can show the little video, which is just of some of the works we've done on Warren's property.
Thanks, Lance. Was that you finished, or did you have any more comments to add at the end there quickly?
Yeah, that was it. Just thought I'd finish on the video, make it easier.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Lance. Yeah, it was a great video. Just really good to see that drone footage to get that real perspective on the scale of the works, and yeah, obviously how it's that landscape scale. And yeah, it'd be interesting to see. So the works are, so you've done all the plans for the farms, and then the work is sort of happening at the moment.
Warren's plan was done prior to the grant. That was jointly funded by Common Land and Mulloon Institute. So we're obviously able to start implementing that earlier. So the plans for the other properties are just in completion at the moment. So they'll get some implementation through the grant over the next 12 months.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, it'd be good to catch up later in the year, or just to follow along, just to monitor or see how they're all going over time. So yeah, I think we'll have another webinar, I think.
Happy to do that, and
Yeah.
we'll be running field days and other events as well. So people are obviously welcome to come along to those. That'd
be great. No, thanks, Lance. So there wasn't any questions, but if anyone did have any for Lance, we can call them out at the end. So we might get cracking with Warren. But yeah, if anyone thought of anything, there's the chat box down the bottom, just as a reminder. So, all right. Well, now we'll cross to Warren, who will talk about his farming system and yeah, how the project's happening on his property. So thanks, Warren.
Thanks, Bonnie, and good morning, everyone. Hopefully this won't be death by PowerPoint, but yeah, I've just put a quick preso together. I'm going to rip through it pretty quickly, and allow some time for questions at the end. So, and to explain, I suppose as I go, the video that Lance just had up of our property and kind of how that has evolved. So I'll just share my screen. So Paraway Farm, we're located at Boyup Brook, so just out of Boyup Brook. And this is a little bit of a journey, I suppose, of how did we get to where we are today. And I think, everyone who's farming is on a journey to a degree. So, and we're in an ever-changing environment. So, so we're constantly, monitoring what we're doing, I suppose. So we purchased the farm here at Boyup Brook in 2001. We're on 1,640 acres, 664 hectares, 650 to 700 mil rainfall is what we were told when we bought the property. Soil types were mainly duplex, typical WA type soils with gravels here, with some granite and a little bit of heavier red loam country. Our pH was sort of 3.8 to 4.5, which is fairly typical, with moderate levels of soil organic carbon. Property had essentially never been cropped. It had always run livestock, sheep and cattle, so always been sort of a pasture base. Annual pastures with some good areas of remnant vegetation, married, jarrah, flooded gum, blackbutt and wandoo, and generally they left trees on most of our hilltops, so not completely cleared. So we do have some remnant veg and some bush areas that haven't been cleared, but characterised very much by these dry ridge tops and waterlogged valley sides and floors, obviously in winter time, with some salinity coming out. So while we don't have that very broad salinity you get in the wet belt, we have these pockets of salinity that are coming out. So we're in the Blackwood Valley catchment. We're very much at the top of the catchment, and on our farm we range from about 220 to 280 metres above sea level. So we have about a 50 or 60 metre fall on the property. So from the tops of the ridge down to the bottom of the creek. So it's quite undulating, and particularly from a wet belt perspective, more undulating than typically what it would be in the wet belt. So our past management, so 02 to 04, we pretty much ran the place fairly conventionally, had some rotation of livestock, but you know, just shifting sort of cattle once in a while between paddocks. I'll say that, yeah, we're a cattle-based operation. Conventional fertilizer inputs and using some, you know, selective herbicides to control, you know, capeweed and grasses and that sort of thing, and red mite control. So pretty stock standard. 04, I wasn't overly happy with the direction we were going in terms of our management, so I attended a grazing for profit course, and that was kind of the catalyst to heading us down the road that we've taken since then, and still is very much a guiding light in terms of our management. So did grazing for profit, came home, went wire and water mad, which can happen. Anyone that's done grazing for profit, it's one of the things I tell you not to do, is to go home and just sort of chill out for a while and think about all this information you've just been given, and not to do anything too silly, which is exactly the opposite what I did. So I thought I knew what I was doing, and you know, put all these subdivisions in and put some water out, and thought I was doing a fantastic job. We transitioned to sort of softer fertilizers, so went to, you know, Western mineral fertilizer type products, and sort of cut out our herbicides and insecticides. In 08, we decided to become certified organic with our beef production, and that was very much a market-driven opportunity at the time. There was quite a significant premium for organic beef back then. So, and we very much went the cold turkey approach. So we pretty much pulled the plug on inputs for a number of years, and really relied on our grazing management to grow us our grass, which worked to a degree. And probably more so from 010 onwards, after doing a holistic planned grazing course, and really got a better handle of how to manage those larger mobs of cattle. You know, we were shifting up to sort of 600, 700, 800 head of cattle in one mob. And if you don't get that right, it can be a train wreck. And we did have a few train wrecks prior to probably 2010. So, and very much, you know, it's about matching the stocking rate to the current carrying capacity. So, and we're aiming for that 100% grass cover, or 100% ground cover all of the time. So we stock pretty conservatively now compared to what we would have been prior to 010. And if those can remember, 2010 was a particularly ordinary year, probably the worst year we've had here. The spring was very much non-existent. So we made some pretty big changes to our management after that year. 16 to 18, we started to introduce some biological inputs. So this was sort of under the influence of Nicole Masters, and we started you know, making some compost teas and extracts and putting fish fertilizers, and, you know, started to put some inputs back out there. And at that point in time, we're just sort of starting to get to the point where fertilizer prices were really increasing, and organic fertilizers were just going through the roof. So we were using some organic fertilizers, particularly where we're cutting hay and that sort of thing. But we were trying to cut as much of that out as possible because it was just becoming super expensive. In 19, we let our organic certification go. And that was mainly due to the fact that the premium for organic beef had pretty much evaporated out of the market, and we wanted to do things on our farm, and even in the biological system, we were wanting to use some inputs that were, and the organic certification was too restrictive. So for what we wanted to do and the outcomes we were wanting to achieve. And then so in 19, we started to use some targeted conventional inputs, mainly looking at phosphorus and calcium, and knockdown herbicides for growing hay and that sort of thing. So that's kind of where we got to in 2019. And then COVID hit and the world changed. But luckily nothing changed too much on the farm in terms of that. So okay, so the end of 2019, we found that our rainfall average, basically, I had some records prior to we purchased the property. For that 22-year period, we were back to about 630 mils. So according to what we were told, the average was we'd lost some rainfall. But a few positives, we'd increased our soil pH. Generally, that was up around 5.6, and our soil organic carbon had increased. So our grazing management has had an impact on those two components. There's no doubt about that. We have established some perennial pastures over the journey with very mixed results. During that time, we'd fenced off most of our creek lines and some of our areas of remnant trees. And we have seen through our grazing management some gains in pasture productivity. But particularly since we've started splitting our paddocks up, and I'll show you a farm map later of where we are now compared to where we started. And we're finding those smaller paddock sizes, we're definitely getting a lot better pasture utilisation and high stocking rates across the year compared to our larger paddocks. What we did find though is the waterlogging in the saline areas were not improving. They were we'd stabilised them to a degree. They weren't sort of getting worse, but they weren't decreasing, and we still had those areas of waterlogged country that should be some of our most productive, but are some of our least productive. So it was a real sort of recognition to achieve our goal, which is really, one of my goals is to leave the farm in a better place than when we first got it. We needed to implement a farming system change, because if we just kept doing what we were doing, then we couldn't see anything was really going to change in a positive. So that's where landscape rehydration comes into it. And I'd always been interested in the work of Peter Andrews. And I think anyone who's seen Peter Andrews' work, and Lance obviously had that the example of what they've done at Mulloon in New South Wales, is very much focused around sort of floodplain, creekline intervention type work. Now, we don't have any of that on our farm. Yes, we have creek lines, but it's very much just creek lines that are draining our landscape. They're not sort of creek lines that are floodplain type creek lines. So for us, I'll get into what we're doing now, but it was then around having the guys from Mulloon on here, and our farm getting a very much a holistic farm plan, and that was kind of the first step. We'd sort of tried a few things, planted a few trees here and there, and probably made the same observation as everyone else tends to do. Is you look at the areas where the symptoms are, generally in the bottoms of the valley floor or at the creek lines, and you fence those areas off and you plant some trees, and we all think it's going to be wonderful. Now, really, we need to take that whole of landscape approach and start looking at the ridgeline. So we had this, our farm plan was co-funded jointly by the Mulloon Institute and Commonland, really to get a farm scale demonstration of natural sequence farming or landscape rehydration set up in WA that is based around WA conditions. So the plan was co-designed with Peter Hazel, who's one of Mulloon's senior landscape technicians and Lance Mudgway. So Lance was obviously involved on the ground here in WA, and I think it's bloody fantastic that Mulloon do now have someone based in WA that obviously knows WA conditions. So the plan was really based around 3 zones that Lance spoke about, principal. So looking at the recharge zone, the ag zone, and the filtration or the protected zone, as we kind of call it on our place. And we focused on the central catchment very much on our farm. So we divided our farm into 3 catchments. And the central catchment is interesting because we control every drop of water in that catchment. So it literally starts on our property and then flows out through our boundary in a creek, into the Boyup Brook, into the Blackwood River. So we are right at the top of the Blackwood River catchment. And the view that we've taken is, while we're looking at our farm in isolation and trying to address issues on our property, there's a broader catchment issue here. And we all know that, or for those people that are from this part of the country, know that, you know, essentially the Blackwood River now is just a sewer. You know, it's not a live, active river. It's just draining mostly water that's either saline or full of nutrients. So if we're ever going to rehabilitate that Blackwood River, you've got to start at the top of the catchment. So that's really our focus, is that central catchment on our property. So stage 1, which we started implementing last year, consisted of 35 hectares of multi-species trees and shrubs and around 5 k's of the contours that you saw the grader putting in, which are on the level. So they're not taking water anywhere, they're holding water back. And the contours are mostly higher in the landscape. We do have some a little bit lower, and I'll explain the purpose for that in a minute. And the implementation was May last year. So that footage that you saw of the grader, that was in May last year, and then the trees went in July. So it was a little bit difficult to pick out the trees and the shrubs from the recent drone footage, but they are actually going gangbusters. Like, it's just amazing the growth that we've got out of those trees, particularly over summer. And we've had an extremely dry summer. We've literally had no rain up until a week ago, since the beginning of November. So we've gone 4 months with 0 rain. We had 9 mils last week. That was the first drop we've had. So pretty amazing. So that's that central catchment I'm talking about. So you can see the tree belts here that we've put in. This is a contour here. We've got another contour down here, another contour through here. And then these tree belts that are really sitting right at the tops of the landscape. Another contour here, with trees in here, and trees underneath these contours to act as sort of secondary filter zones. So the implementation, so from our perspective, was very much a custom design for our property. And my feeling around this work, there isn't a one size fits all. I think it is very much has to be designed around your property and the issues that you have on your property, because I think we're all a little bit different in terms of where we sit in a landscape and what issues we have going on. So the zones, so we have that recharge zone, which we're calling, I'm calling sort of zone A, recharge zone A, so that's the multi-species trees and shrubs. And the multi-species aspect is really important. So we haven't gone with single species. We also want to drive ecology and biodiversity. So we have 35 different species were planted, and they were all mixed up when we planted them. So we've got, different trees next to each other. So we're really looking for that ecological outcome as well. So there's blocks of those on tops of the ridges. That one contour that was right on top of the landscape. So trees on the top side of that, and then on the underside in another part. Our Ag Zone A, which is going to be directly underneath those areas. Last year we had a multi-species annual crop in there. So 23 and onwards, we'll be putting multi-species perennial pastures. So they'll all get sown down to perennial pastures. Then the Recharge Zone B, which is those contours that are further down the landscape. And then a row of trees planted under them. And they sit directly above these waterlogged areas that we have. So I'll just go back a touch. You can see these areas in here are these badly waterlogged areas. So essentially what we've done is we've planted trees up the top. This is our first Ag Zone in here where perennials will go. This is this Recharge Zone B where we've put in a contour and trees. And then this waterlogged area is in here. So it's quite an extensive area if you look at the total area of the farm. So now these areas have all now been split up into smaller sections as well. So that Zone B last year, we just had hay and pasture in those areas last year, just getting some productivity back in there. This year we're going to, in some of those areas, we're going to plant some more, water log tolerant clovers and medic for hay and pasture. So we just want to get some productivity back in there. We're going to be doing some soil amelioration work in there as well with calcium and some biological fertilizers. And then the plan is to go with some multi-species perennials once we have some of that under control and once we start controlling some of that excess water that's coming out. And some of that water saline, some of it isn't. It varies. And our soil testing shows us that as well. We had one area where we soil tested and the sodium levels were through the roof, and another area not far away and the sodium levels were okay. So it's not constant across the landscape. Then the protected zones down the bottom, which is our fenced off creek lines, and that's like our final filter. We've done some gully interventions, as Lance showed, in those areas that are kind of really need some help. Stock will be completely excluded from one or two of those areas for a period of time. And we've got some other work we're looking to potentially do in there as well, which could be around sort of silvopasture in those areas. So it's very much, for us, it's this layered zone approach is how we're sort of approaching this. For rehydration, and I slipped this in, and Lance might not like this word dehydration, but I feel that those waterlogged areas we're needing to dehydrate them first, because the problem is not that there's enough water there. There's actually too much bloody water at certain times of the year at the moment. So we're doing these works higher in the landscape to dehydrate them, but over time, we want to establish that or re-establish that small water cycle that Lance was talking about. And at the moment, it's obviously completely out of whack. So we're also looking at this from a management point of view. So we're splitting out our ag zones based on where it sits in the landscape. So really using the contours as a management tool, obviously for shelter, for livestock ecology. And the one I didn't put in here that was in Lance's presentation, which is so important, is the thermoregulation. And we're just seeing that at the moment with the dews. We're starting to get dews, and you go out where we've got perennials and there's dew there. And I think that we don't pay enough or put enough importance on that thermoregulation that the plants can do. So our current and future. How am I going for time, Bonnie? Pull me up if I'm going over?
we're nearly at 5 to 11, but
Right.
yeah, happy
I'll just quickly run through this. So another one of our overarching goals is to ensure that any water that leaves our property is fresh and with minimal nutrient content. So we're going to be doing a whole lot of measurement and monitoring around that. So, and our focus is very much around improving the water cycle, building soil carbon, and restoring our farm ecology and natural capital. So not obviously to what it was pre-settlement, but getting it back into a better balance. We have some underlying soil constraints that we need to address: aluminium, iron, and sodium. So we're looking at that. We're going to be establishing a whole heap of multi-species perennials, further paddock subdivisions, using livestock as landscape engineers, which we're doing now in our smaller subdivisions, completing our farm plan, which is going to, this year we have another 10 hectares of trees to go in, and some biodiversity corridors, which is going to link up some of our trees. And the one that we really want to have a good crack at going forward is some cultural land practices. So starting to manage some of these areas, particularly areas that we're fencing off now that we're not going to graze livestock through on a regular basis, doing some burning in there at appropriate times of the year to start stimulating the ecology. So this is a farm map from, this one here is from around about 2003, 2004, so a couple of years after we bought the property. I think there's 20 odd paddocks in here. This is our current map, with subdivisions included. These areas are just single wire fenced, and then we use tapes to divide them up. This is what we may use. We can make them smaller. We have now around 90 odd paddocks. So, you know, these areas where we have these smaller paddocks, we are finding where we're getting the most productivity. This area in here, this will be our sort of stage B. We'll do a similar thing in this area going forward as well. So I expect that, you know, we'll probably have over our sort of 470 odd hectares of grazable land, we'll probably end up with around 130, 140 subdivisions. We also have a carbon project. I won't go too much into that. That is attached to the tree project, so that's giving us some income as well. Some of the tools we use MyGrazing for our grazing management. Soil Mentor, which is a really cool observational tool we're now using. Downforce Technology, which is a new company that we're looking at remote soil carbon and could be doing some soil carbon with work with them going forward, and looking also at remote natural capital. So I think that's about it, guys. Sorry I had to really wrap through that, but if everyone comes next week to our workshop, you'll hear more about it. Thanks, Bonnie.
Yeah, thanks, Warren. Yeah, I guess just mindful of those that do have to jump off at 11. Yeah, there's going to be a workshop next week at Warren's, run through the Mulloon Institute. So there's still tickets available. There's a half-day introductory workshop and then a full day, or is that 1 or 2 day more advanced workshop?
Two-day boot camp after that.
2-day boot camp.
Thursday.
Yeah, so and also this is being recorded. So if you have to jump off and you're going to miss, because there are a few questions, you can jump back on and watch the recording afterwards to catch up. We'll also email out the link if you wanted to get tickets to that as well. So we'll send all of that out. But for those that are happy to stay on and just go through some of the questions, I can go through those now. But yeah, thanks, Warren. I just wanted to say, like, thank you for being so transparent with your journey as well, because it's, yeah, sort of taken a lot for you to get to where you're at now, and it's really appreciated, I think, for other farmers and us in the more supporting roles to hear that, so that we can all understand and know that, yeah, it takes a lot to get to where you're at. So appreciate that. And the other point you made about it's really great having Lance here in WA. Now he's got Shane, a colleague that's just joined as well. It's really great to have that on ground expertise in WA to help with some of these projects. Obviously, as climate change is becoming more prominent, or the effects of climate change are becoming more prominent. The other things you mentioned, you did the grazing for profit school. So for those that weren't aware of that, that's run through RCS. So you can look those up if you're interested in attending one of those, because yeah, I've heard they're really worthwhile doing. And into the questions, the first one for you, Warren, was about what did you do around your creek lines? So I know you said you fenced them off, but did you do any other works with the creeks or creek lines?
No, not really. I mean, depends exactly what you call creek lines. There's obviously that you know, eroded, scalded area where we're putting some of those brush weirs in, and we'll do a few other little interventions in there. But in terms of the main creek lines, no, all we've really done is fence them off, exclude the livestock, and you know, trees, particularly the flooded gums, have started coming back in there on their own. I think there are areas that going forward, while we'll keep them fenced off most of the time, we will graze livestock back through there at certain points, I think, or use some burning in there just to you know, just to keep regenerating it. Because I think one of the things I firmly believe is just fencing country off and doing nothing with it, I don't think necessarily is ecologically the right thing to do in the long run. I think it can potentially go forward for a period of time, and then it'll start going backwards ecologically.
So even with the multi-species shrubs and trees that you planted, did you keep livestock off those while they were taking off?
Yeah, absolutely. So the trees that we put in as part of the landscape rehydration work, yeah, they'll be fenced off. They are fenced off now. And my expectation is that we won't put stock through there for at least 4 or 5 years. But I just want to see how it goes. I mean, yeah, in some of those areas as well, we've fenced off some of the remnant trees that were on tops of the ridges. Because the one thing is, you walk through the bush areas that have been open to livestock, and there's all these beautiful mature trees which are kind of getting towards the end of their life. They're still serving a function, but in terms of carbon that they're sequestering and water uptake, they're probably not in their prime anymore. And the thing, there's no recruitment coming underneath because the livestock have access to those areas. So we're fencing those areas off as well, so we start to get some recruitment. And I'm not sure really when we can introduce livestock back in there, because the thing is, you know, you have a little seedling that comes up and a bloody cow goes in there and steps on it, it's buggered. So it's going to be a bit of a suck it and see in terms of how we do manage those tree areas going forward, I think.
Yeah. Oh, thanks for that. And yeah, like it'd be really interesting to follow that and see what you do end up doing, or if you try those different things and how that all works.
And I'll probably just also, given that we have a carbon project attached to those areas as well, we've got to be super careful we don't take them out because if we take the trees out, we're in trouble.
Yes. Yeah. So I guess there's a couple of questions for you, Lance. So first one's from Megan. What is the cost for the works and the plan on a property?
That's a hard one. It's going to be really variable depending on what interventions we think are necessary for the property. In terms of warrants, I think probably looking at around, well, Warren could probably, I think you gave me a figure the other day of roughly how much per hectare it would end up being. And although we didn't do a lot in terms of earthworks, there's a lot of trees going in or plants going in. But again, we've also made a decision that it wasn't necessary to do anything in those main creek lines because there's already vegetation there. And as Warren said, it's already starting to recruit seedlings regeneration in there, and hopefully the same will happen on the fenced remnant areas. So obviously we're only going to do work where we need to. Yeah, so it's a hard question to answer. It's a case by case situation, how much it's going to cost.
Yeah. I mean, I'm happy to share that. I mean, the farm plan cost $30,000, but it's a significant plan. And you know, if you look at it at a per hectare basis, it's not actually expensive, and you would spend that much money or more on fertilizer in a single year. So you know, people will probably balk at that, but what it gives you in terms of a blueprint, I think it's worth its weight in gold. And obviously the implementation can be expensive. You know, trees are, depending on how dense you plant them. We went quite dense. We actually planted around 1,100 stems to the hectare, which is probably heavier than what you really need to go, but we wanted to make sure that we were going to get a really good result. So yeah, so the trees, you know, are probably up around $1,000 a hectare for establishment. That's obviously on where you're putting the trees. The contour work's not terribly expensive. I think that worked out to roughly $1,000 a kilometre, Lance, I think, off the top of my head. So the contour work's not terribly expensive. I mean, the good thing about a grader that, you know, they cover a fair bit of land pretty quickly. So yeah, and then obviously there's going to be fencing and other things in there as well. I mean, we run cattle, so our fencing infrastructure is pretty simple. It's just single wire fencing. And then there's obviously water that comes along with that. So, you know, it's not, I suppose it's not just for us, it's not just the landscape rehydration work in isolation. It's everything else that will then flow on from that with our other management that we do. But if you were just to look at the landscape rehydration work, yeah, I think those sort of numbers are a pretty good ballpark.
Well, thanks for sharing that. It's yeah, I guess that actually leads into the next question from Kim, just asking if there's grants available for smaller properties like 10 acres or any opportunities for the Mulloon to work with smaller property owners.
I mean, obviously, yeah, just contact us and we can have a chat and work something out. I'd also suggest that maybe sort of an economic way for a small landholder to go through the process is actually to build your own capacity and that's what the boot camp's about next week, is actually for people to actually be able to build their own capacity and actually go out, prepare a plan for their own property and actually undertake some of the lower risk works on their property. And I guess our vision for how we want to do that over the next few years is to actually provide that sort of capacity building through our boot camps with a follow-up kind of mentoring process where we're accessible for ongoing support. You know, you can ask questions, and I might include a site visit or something if you want us to look at a particular issue or something. But yeah, so, you know, those in terms of cost, it's be a lot cheaper to do a boot camp and do it yourself than to get us out there and actually draw up a plan for you.
Yeah, and I think it's a good point, Lance, and it was, you know, one of the reasons I was super keen to get this work on our place up and running, because it's really the first farm scale work that Mulloon have done in WA. And, you know, we're very open to share in terms of what we do here and what the outcomes will be, because we think it's really important work. So so from that respect, you know, there will be plenty of learning opportunities going forward. So, and I think having it in the WA context makes a big difference as well. And most of us farmers, we kind of learn very much with our eyes. So, if we can put some things into practice and people can see something that they can then take back to their own properties, then that's great.
Yeah, awesome. And so with that, the last question from Jess was that will there be, she said she can't make it next week, but asked if there'll be others in the Great Southern later in the year.
Nothing's written down on paper at this stage, but yeah, there will be, through the stewardship grant, we'll need to be doing a bit more in terms of the educational side of things, and we'll be definitely doing field days to basically show the demonstration of the 3 sites, and we've actually got a FDF grant in at the moment which will involve a boot camp. We don't know where that'll be yet, but and so if that grant gets granted, we'll be running stuff, and we'll be running stuff anyway over time. So yeah, just keep your eyes out. I guess we'll most likely we'll obviously advertise on our own website, and we'll also advertise through RegenWA. So yeah, just keep your eyes peeled, and hopefully you'll find out. And the other option is to contact us, and we can put you on our contact list.
Awesome. Now that's great. Like, there's definitely lots of different avenues to take with this, so it's really good that it sort of caters for everyone. And even as a start, like you mentioned, Lance, there's the information hub on the Regen website. Just if you're wanting to dabble a bit more and watch some more videos or read case studies, there's that on our website too. So it's great that there's a lot of info out there. And yeah, I think that, well, that was all the questions, but yeah, I'd just like to thank Lance and Warren for taking the time to join us today out of your busy schedules, and also everyone that attended live. Yeah, really appreciate that. And I thought it was a really good session. So this will be recorded and available later, so those that dropped off can watch later on, or if you wanted to watch it again, we'll send that out to everyone that registered. But yeah, also share it out on our socials and website. Yeah, big thanks to Thomas and the Perth NRM comms team who's helped pull this together as well. And like Lance and Warren said, if you wanted to head along to the workshop next week, we'll share the link for that as well, and any other events that are happening around the place. I think that was everything that we said we'd share. So yeah, with that, I'd like to thank everyone and enjoy the rest of your day.